Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. This week we have a wonderful reminder week regarding the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And instead of like what we normally are accustomed of doing, and that is, reminding everyone of different sunnah that we're in need to revive and bring to everyone's attention, we decided to take a bigger look at things. So regarding the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, a lot of people take for granted or never really thought about how did this sunnah come to us nowadays, more than 1400 years later, knowing that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was illiterate and couldn't read or write. And his companions were told while he was alive, ﷺ, not to write down or record anything that he would say or do. And this was in fear that as he was alive from age 40 to 63, wahi was still being revealed. So he feared that if they would record what he would say or do, they might later on confuse it with wahi of the Quran, the kalam of Allah Azza wa Jal. So after his death, we need to take a closer look at how did his sunnah prevail? How did it get to us now? And how did Allah Azza wa Jal, preserve it for us? And in this, no doubt, we need to look no further than the lives of the Sahaba, starting from the Khulafa al-Rashideen, the four rightly guided caliphs that came after the Prophet ﷺ. And that is Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman ibn Affan, and Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhum jami'an. So the Prophet ﷺ, and before even mentioning the Prophet ﷺ, we could say in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal, He spoke so highly of the Muhajirin and Ansar and the Sahaba in general, and He gave us this news or glad tiding that He is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him at the same time. So in Surah At-Tawbah, Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والسابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه وأعد لهم جنات تجري تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا ذلك الفوز العظيم. So he mentioned, as for the foremost, the first of the immigrants, the Muhajirin, and the Ansar, the helpers, and those who followed them in goodness. We hope that we are from these people. But specifically, the best generations that came after the Muhajirin and the Ansar, for them are these gardens which with rivers flow underneath in this eternal bliss of Jannah. So this is one of the first, we could say tazkiyas, signs of love from Allah to the companions, or vouching for them. The Prophet ﷺ said, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. The Prophet ﷺ is advising and telling the companions, and this is a hadith and reminder for all of us till Yawm ad-Din, that the best of people are my people, my generation. Then the generation that come after, then the generation that come after. So when we talk about the generation of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the Tabi'een, we should really take heed and take note that these are the best of people, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned them and how He is pleased with them, and as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned them and how as well He is vouching for them as being the best of people. So we know that these Sahaba, they were huge reasons as to how and why, this religion kept staying preserved all the way until it did today. And obviously this is by the will of Allah Azza wa Jal, but through these wonderful mountains of men. So now today, I want to discuss more from the lives of specific Sahaba. And that is the 7 trustworthy, prolific, mukaththirun, as they're called in Arabic, meaning they compiled or narrated over 1,000 ahadith, sayings or actions that were done by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Important to know, before I get into who are these 7 known narrators of ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, When we look at the lives of, say, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, or Umar ibn Khattab, or Uthman ibn Affan, Ali ibn Abi Talib, we see that these companions that were so close to the Prophet ﷺ were not from the 7 most narrators of a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is for an obvious reason. As they lived with the Prophet ﷺ a vast majority of their lives, and they died not too long after his life. So obviously Ali ibn Abi Talib lived the longest after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. But for example, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq only narrated about 140 sayings or a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. This does not take away from his status. We know from the highest and the closest as far as companionship to Rasulullah ﷺ was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Other than that, when we look at Bukhari and Muslim, the 2 authentic compilers of hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, we see that in their volumes of compilation of sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, they have over 200 narrators, yani 200 Sahaba that narrated hadith, over 200, each one of them. That being said, who are these 7 most narrators of hadith that really without them tens of thousands of hadiths wouldn't have came to us 1400 years after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So we will start with number 1, and he is going to be known to all of you, and to no surprise, this is Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. And some wonderful things that we really must know about Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. So it is said that he actually only lived with, and we could say side by side with the Prophet ﷺ for only his last 2 years approximately in this dunya. So from the age of say 61, 62 up until his death, 63 years old, alayhi salatu wassalam. Abu Hurairah was with him for such a short period of time, yet his memory was so strong, and he had dedicated those 2 years fully just to observing, listening to, and really seeking all of this ilm that he can receive from the Prophet ﷺ. So upon his death, or after his death we should say, the Prophet ﷺ, when the companions were now compiling the Quran into one book, and the companions were, wanting to compile all of these ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu emerged with over 5,300 sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, or actions that he saw him doing, and he authentically narrated these things to the present Sahaba and Tabi'een at that time. So clearly, he must have been known for his strength of memory. And he also must have been tested, as if you could imagine, just memorizing 100 sayings of somebody would be tough, let alone 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. So after he was narrating so many ahadith, some of the men were doubting, how could his memory be so strong? How can he be so sure? We must test him to make sure that, his memory really is what it is, or else maybe he's forgetting. So what they did is, one day they brought him in a room, and they had hidden a scribe, someone who writes. And they started to ask Abu Hurairah questions, and they kept going back and forth with this dialogue, this conversation. Well, a scribe was hidden, and he was writing down, recording the complete back and forth between Abu Hurairah and these men that were, kind of drilling him with Q&A. And they did not tell him that they were recording this meeting. A year later, they called Abu Hurairah, they summoned him again, and they told him, do you remember that day where we called you into the room, we just started asking you all these questions? He said, yes. Of course, he has a very sharp memory, unlike a lot of us, subhanAllah. They said, do you remember that day? Can you recall what we asked you, what your answers were? Can you recall the dialogue? They wanted to see, not just if he could remember the gist of the meeting, they wanted to see how precise was he in remembering verbatim, word for word, the conversation. In that, they then told him, because we have recorded it. We had a scribe write it all down. He did not know this. So then when he began to talk, to their surprise, He had recalled word for word everything that he was being questioned about in all of his responses, verbatim, word for word, word for word. This was Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. It is said that in the house of Abu Hurairah, it was he, his wife, and a daughter that he had. And their nights would be split into thirds. 1/3, his wife would be up praying qiyam. The next third, his daughter would be up praying qiyam. The last third of the night, he would be up praying qiyam. So the household of Abu Hurairah would always be having dhikr of Allah and ibadatullah azza wa jal happening, laylan wa nahara, throughout the days and the nights. This was Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, who lived more than 50 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So like we said in the beginning, unlike these other known Sahaba like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhuma jami'an, these narrators that we're going to mention, whether they were older or younger in age, they lived a long time after his death, alayhi salatu wassalam. So number 2, we have Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu anhu. And Abdullah bin Umar, no doubt, is very known. He is the son of none other than Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. And Abdullah bin Umar was younger in age when he started to really sit with the Prophet ﷺ and sit with the Sahaba and intake this knowledge. And he has some amazing stories, which I'm going to mention. But he is second to Abu Hurairah with over 2,600 authentically narrated ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And he lived approximately 60 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So one time, he was in a gathering with kibar as-sahaba, including his father Umar, including Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and he was younger in age. And the Prophet ﷺ asked the Sahaba a question. Which tree is like the Muslim? Or which tree is like the mu'min? Its leaves do not wither. Like it's a strong tree. It's a good representation of who is a Muslim. And the Sahaba didn't know. And they would ask the Prophet ﷺ, when he would ask these type of questions, they would say, Allahu wa Rasulahu a'lam. Allah and His Messenger know best. And Abdullah bin Umar, he thought to himself, the date palm tree. He thought that it must be the date palm tree. But he said that he was shy to answer in front of these major scholars. He's narrated this hadith and he's giving us his explanation, commentary on this hadith. And of course, in this great hadith, we benefit a lot about how this date palm tree, it is strong, it is beautiful, it is beneficial. It goes through hard climates and hard living conditions and stays strong. When rocks are thrown at it, it just gives off its rutab, its beneficial things. It does not benefit. Even from its leaves, its huge leaves can be benefited from, and its shade. So this is a hadith that was narrated by Abdullah bin Umar, and he was listening attentively and really focusing and learning from the Prophet from a young age. And it's nice to mention as well, he's actually the brother-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ, as the Prophet ﷺ married his sister Hafsa, the daughter of Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhu. Number 3 would be Anas ibn Malik, who narrated over 2,200 ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Something amazing about Anas ibn Malik that's very much related to everyone who was watching this video, as far as students go, is that he was actually like given to be a worker or a servant boy, helper to the Prophet ﷺ at the age of 10. Like he was gifted from his mother to the Prophet ﷺ to live in the household of the Prophet ﷺ and to help. Really, it was so that he could learn under the tutelage of the Prophet ﷺ. And in this, he was with the Prophet ﷺ from the age of 10 to 20. That's when the Prophet ﷺ died. So for 10 years, think about this. Everyone who is listening, most everyone listening, is between this age. He did not just live with the Prophet ﷺ like this. He lived and was learning, memorizing sayings and actions and doings of the Prophet ﷺ. So much so that he even said that I worked for the Prophet ﷺ 10 years and I never heard from him even as little as the word uff. Right? Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, وَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا uff. For the kids never to say to their parents uff. Like a small word, uff. It's a small word, but even this shouldn't be said. to our parents. He said, I lived with the Prophet ﷺ more than 10 years. Never did I hear from him even the word uff. And I'm supposed to be working for him, serving him. But from this age, obviously, you would assume that, yeah, you might hear some scolding or something like this. He said, never did I hear from him uff. And never did he blame me by saying, why did you do so? Or why didn't you do so? Like, why didn't you do so and so? Or why did you do so and so? As far as like reprimanding him. Why are you here and why are you not here? He said one time I was late and I was watching the young boys in the street. They were playing. He came behind me and just put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't even tell me, why are you late? Why were you doing this? Why are you not here? Nothing. And he was there to be at his aid. But this was the akhlaq and the character of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ made dua for Anas. He said, Allahumma akthir malahu wa waladahu wa barik lahu fima a'taytahu. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase him in wealth and in children and bless what He has given him. And it is known that he lived more than 80 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And he was one of the most wealthy of the Sahaba. And he outlived almost all of the Sahaba and went into the lives of Tabi'een and even Tabi'een. And he was known for having many kids and a lot of wealth. This is Anas ibn Malik, the third most narrator of ahadith. Fourth, and this is a big, what should I say? Like vouching and a big honor for one of his wives, and not just his most beloved wife, but the most beloved person to him. When asked, who is the most beloved person to you, Ya Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he replied, Aisha radiyallahu anha. And when they asked him from the men, he said, her father. He didn't even say Abu Bakr, which obviously her father is Abu Bakr. He said, her father. So this is a great love that he had for Aisha. And many people wonder, why did he marry Aisha so young? Here's a clear, beautiful hikmah, wisdom, as to why he married Aisha when she was so young in age. Number one, out of his 11 total wives that he had married in his lifetime, she is the number one most narrator of ahadith. She's fourth on the overall list, narrating more than 2,000 ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Ayat from the Quran were revealed in Surah An-Nur to prove her innocence when she was accused of being unchaste by the hypocrites. So Aisha's fadl is known in the ummah, and she is the number 4 most known thiqat. Number 5, Abdullah ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhu. And Abdullah ibn Abbas was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, also very young in age. Imagine, narrating more than 1,600 ahadith. Think about this, more than 1,600 ahadith. Yet when the Prophet ﷺ died, he was only 13 years old. So that means for 13 years only, he lived with the Prophet ﷺ. Yani, we could say his first 2, 3, 4 years, he's just a baby. He doesn't really know much. But for 13 years only, he was associated with the Prophet ﷺ, yet he narrated 1,600 ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. From probably the most famous, and before his passing away, ﷺ, he was known as Hibrul Ummah, the ink pot. He was known as the ink pot. He was known as, Al-Bahr, the ocean, because of his vastness of knowledge. 13 years old. He was known as Tarjuman al-Quran, the interpreter of the Quran, at 13 years of age. What an honor. Lived more than 50 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. His probably most famous hadith is the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, Ya ghulam, inni u'allimuka kalimat. And then he goes on to mention beautiful, long, profound points. If you ask of Allah. If you seek refuge in Allah. Beautiful hadith that still to this day echoed upon the minbars all over the world. All of these, khutaba are constantly mentioning this wonderful hadith that was narrated by Abdullah bin Abbas. Also, the Prophet ﷺ put his hand on the shoulder of Abdullah bin Abbas and made dua. Allahumma faqihhu fi din wa allimhu ta'wil. That may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him understanding in this religion and teach him the interpretation of the Quran. So when the Prophet ﷺ is going to make dua for you, we know that this is going to be a golden thing, and this is not going to be something that's just forgotten about. So this is number 5. Number 6, Jabir ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhu. Something amazing and beautiful about Jabir radiallahu anhu. He accepted Islam when he was 7 years old. Imagine, where were we when we were 7? How was our mindset when we were 7? Probably we're just learning to do things like ride a bike, and play different sports, use different devices. He was embracing Islam. He was 7 years old, embracing Islam. He narrated more than 1,500 ahadith, mainly related to Hajj. One of the 5 pillars of Islam. And we know in the Quran, the manasik, the rituals of Hajj, are not really mentioned that much at all. So we're in need to see the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and study how can we do this wonderful, important pillar of Islam, Hajj. And in reading upon how did the Prophet ﷺ, the kayfiyah of how the Prophet ﷺ made Hajj, we see that Jabir radiallahu anhu narrated many of those hadith. And he lived more than 70 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And he was actually in approximately 19 battles side by side with the Prophet ﷺ. And after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he taught in Medina, in Egypt, and in Syria. So he was even a teacher of ahadith for many, many years, as were a lot of these Sahaba. And last but not least, we have Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu, who narrated over 1,000 hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and he lived over 50 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, why are we mentioning all of these wonderful companions? These companions were flag bearers for this deen. And I want us all, including myself first and foremost, to think for a minute. After our death, what will we have left behind in this dunya? What kind of sadaqah jariyah have I done? I've watched a lot of videos, I've read a lot of books, I memorized such and such of Quran, I prayed this many prayers, I fasted this many Ramadans, but have I left an impact in this ummah as these Sahaba did? We are mentioning their names, obviously because we are following the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we are loving the Prophet ﷺ, we are holding the Prophet ﷺ in such high regard, but his Sunnah, his way, his actions only came to us through Allah Azza wa Jal preserving them through these wonderful people. Radiyallahu anhum jami'an. May Allah have mercy upon them all. هذا والله تعالى أعلم وجزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.